All right. So, good afternoon. My name is Niama Kwe. I'm the co-founder of Certified Africa. I just want to say a very big welcome to anybody who is joining right now. I see Conscious Contractors. Oh, Francois, good to see you. Good to have you here. Yeah, I appreciate you. So I'll be just going right into it. So I'm live on Instagram on Certified Africa, and I'm also live on Facebook. So I just want to share my thoughts on a few things, which has been ongoing. So you just stay with me. I have some people on Facebook. Let me just say a quick hello to you all real quick. What do we have here? Yeah, I did. Let me see who is online. Facebook. Yeah, I did. All right, welcome. Thank you for joining. Just Asa19. Yeah, thank you for joining. So I'll be getting right into it. So today, basically, what I'll be talking about is something which is a little touchy that has been currently ongoing. Hello, Francois. That has been currently ongoing, and I want to call it drawing the line between Black injustice in America and repatriating to Africa. Maybe I'll add the Caribbean to it, but I consider the Caribbean kind of Africa. So look at it. I mean, if you want to consider it Africa, you can. Or if you want to repatriate back to what do you call it? To the Caribbean, you can do that as well. I want to call it. So I'm trying to see who's joining me on Facebook. Drawing the line between Black injustice. Okay. Who's joining me on Facebook? All right, let me see who's here yet, but I have two people online. Okay, who is this? Lamar the Poet. Thank you for joining. So we're looking at drawing the line between Black injustice in America and then also, what do you call it? Repatriating to Africa. So this is very key, and this is important because we're in the times that this conversation has been called for. I mean, I know there's a conversation that has been had so many years before now, and it's a very touchy area when you're trying to look at the things that are happening to Black people in America, and you want to also, compare it to or using that to say people should move to Africa. It's very tricky, when you want to have that conversation. But I want to share my thoughts on that because I think it's very important. It's a hard conversation we have to keep having, until the time we either have justice on one side or until the time all Black people, of course, outside of Africa, begin to develop the mindset of considering Africa as a place, not necessarily to move to or run to completely, but as an alternative in terms of a place that will welcome you, that can give you a common ground, which I'll be dealing with, where you can actually draw that line between the two. Now, so first of all, when we talk about, of course, repatriation, we're basically looking at somebody returning to their origin, basically their place of origin. So that's very key. If you want to begin a conversation of repatriating back to where you're coming from, it's not just about going back, but it's about going back to a place that you're originally from. And I don't think there's too much debate around, whether or not Black people are from Africa or not. Of course, some people can debate it, but I think every Black person anywhere in the world, you kind of technically come from Africa, basically. You originate from Africa, especially if you're African American, especially. There's no two ways about that. And if you're in the Caribbean, there's no argument about that. You actually originate from Africa. So it's important to establish that. So we'll talk about repatriation. It's not an offensive thing. It's not any big deal. It's just simply saying that relook at where you actually originate from. Now, so many different things could lead to a person leaving a place to going to somewhere else or going to be somewhere else. Different things can actually make that happen. But at the end of the day, once you find yourself somewhere else, which is not where you actually originated from, there's always a need to relook at where you actually originate from. And especially in looking at that juxtapose the injustice at where you are, it becomes more crucial. Now, I like to start by addressing the injustice in America. Now, of course, I mean, the injustice in America didn't start today, and everybody can attest to that. Anybody who's been in America or has read a little bit of history will know that injustice in America towards Black people didn't start from today. Now, when you look back at history all the way to slavery, from the day that Black people, the first slaves arrived in America, that was when the injustice against Black people in America actually began. Of course, I don't want to consider what happened from Africa, but I'm looking at the fact that from the day the first ship landed in the Caribbean and in America, that's when the injustice against Black people began. So injustice against Black people, of course, is good to establish. It's important to establish that it didn't start from today. It didn't start from yesterday. It started all the way back from the first time a Black person arrived in Africa. And we've had to deal with that situation for a very long time. Now, that is not right. Okay, in a humanly sense, it is never right. And in the legal sense, whatever sense, it is never right for any race to try to treat another human being, another race, inhumane. It is very wrong, and we can all, bear with that. And I'm sure the oppressor can also understand that fact. But it is important to understand that it didn't start from today. So when we're having the conversation, we need to appreciate the fact that this is something that has started so many years ago. And at the time, of course, we didn't have a lot of say. We didn't have a lot of say at the time. We were just kind of passive, because when the first slaves arrived, there was injustice against Black people, but they didn't really have a say. They could not really, say anything. They could not revolt. They could not, at the time, they could not, protest or anything like that. It was very difficult. But as time progressed and the Black man lived in America for some time, of course, things began to change. The Black man began to find, some kind of, let me say, voice in terms of being able to really push back for it to make a difference. At the time, they may try escaping and all of that. That's all that was happening. But they couldn't really, have a lot of say to be able to effect any change. So we left that regime and came to, of course, the civil rights movement. A lot of things transpired in between that time, which I'm not going into all that history lessons, but I'm trying to build a point and try and draw a line between, the injustice happening in America and the need to have the conversation about repatriating back to Africa. I want to be able to draw that line. That's why I'm taking it from how this all started and where we are today. Okay, so we came to the civil rights movement where, of course, Black people had a little more power in terms of voice. So we had moved from the slave era where we had very little to do to a place where now we could actually speak out, although our voices were still being subdued. But we had a chance to be able to speak out in America. So the injustice was still there. I mean, we're still beating Black people, killing Black people, doing all the things that we're doing, but we had some stronger voice. We had people who stood up, like the Martin Luther Kings and, of course, the Marcus Garveys and Malcolm X, and a lot of women who stood up and fought at the time to bring us closer to where we are today. So we had a civil rights movement and the people who were actually fighting to make sure that the injustice against Black people in America ceased. So we had all of these fights up until, let me say, the times in which we are, where now a lot of the laws, of course, were changed to favor Black people, because those times, most of the laws, in fact, I watched the movie, it was called, The House Help, if I'm not mistaken, The Help. And of course, he talked about some of the laws that could be made instantly. If a Black person did something, they could actually make a law that could address that which wasn't there before. So these were all injustices that were happening, even during the civil rights time, where we now have a little bit of voice. And we had people who stood up and were fighting and pushing back against all the injustice that was actually happening to Black people. But that didn't stop the injustice. It still continued up until, of course, where we are today. Well, of course, don't forget, most of our people who are really pushing back were killed in the process, but they didn't give up. They still fought, just like our forefathers who arrived, fought or kept their resilience up until the civil rights movement. And now we're here today. So that is to say that, of course, the injustice that we're dealing with in America did not start from today, but a group of people have been fighting, and we've all been adding our voice up until now. I say we've all social media everywhere today. We've been adding our voice to the fight against the injustice that is happening. So we've all been contributing. Now we have a lot more say in terms of what change can happen. And as you can see, of course, recent events with the gentleman that was choked to death, where you have people protesting, and by that protest, somebody has been arrested, and it's been happening. But of course, he hasn't still stopped the injustice in America. And what I'm suggesting is, of course, we keep doing what we're doing. We keep fighting against the injustice that is happening to Black people. We have to keep fighting. We have to keep pushing back. As long as Black people exist in this world, we don't have to give up that fight. We have to keep fighting. Now, however, my point here is, despite the fact that we have to keep pushing back and keep fighting against Black people in America who are being oppressed, who are being tormented still by the oppressor from way back up until now, we still now have to relook at the idea of repatriating back to Africa, which I think a lot of Black people in America kind of close their minds to it. They feel like once they begin to consider that aspect, it's like they're trying to run away from a fight, which is where I'll eventually dwell on, to draw a line, because I want to submit, to you that the fact that you're considering the idea of repatriating to Africa does not necessarily mean that you're running from Africa, you're running from America, or you're running from a fight. Otherwise, we'll get the whole thing wrong. We'll get the whole thing wrong, because don't forget, like I said, the injustice started way back. It hasn't stopped. It's good for us to push back, for us to fight. If you look at the progress we have made, a lot of different people have stood up, and we've been fighting up until this point that at least now we have a stronger voice and we can effect some change. We're hoping that we can fight and make it better in the future. However, we also have to begin to look at the idea of repatriation back to Africa. So let me shift to the idea of repatriation back to Africa. Then I draw the line between the two. So you give me your thoughts on what you think. I see Carlton. Carlton, thank you for being here. I appreciate you. So now if you look at the likes of Marcus Garvey, he was a very key person in the fight for, repatriation back to Africa. A lot of different people over time talked about the idea of, Black people in America really looking at Africa as a place that they can actually be. Okay. Marcus Garvey was a very key person that I believe kind of stood out in terms of trying to see how Black people can actually repatriate back to their origin, to where they're actually coming from. Because don't forget, whether we like it or not, in the beginning I mentioned that every Black person in America, African American or whatever, you originated from Africa, because until the first ship landed, I don't think there were Black people in America. I don't think. Somebody can debate that. I know there's been some arguments about that, but from where I sit, I believe that for the Caribbean and African Americans in America, of course, it all started from the slave trade, and that's how we arrived here. So when we're talking about repatriation, what Garvey is trying to tell us is that there's a place that we actually originate from. For some reasons, we happen to be here by no choice of ours. Yes, that's true. And we've been resilient and been standing firm up until this point. But that does not stop us from beginning to relook at the idea of going back to where we're coming from. Now, not from a place of weakness, but from a place of strength. And I'll demonstrate that, because when you look at repatriating back to Africa as a place of strength, you do not feel the need to think that I have to necessarily fight from a place of, okay, this is something I've worked hard for, so I can't leave it for you and go somewhere. No, you begin to look at it differently. That look, if for some reasons I find myself at a place that I do not originate from, and I lose touch with where I am actually from. Now, there's nothing absolutely wrong in re-looking at a place, especially if I'm being treated unjust here. As much as I keep fighting, I want to now go and establish some grounds on where I actually originate from, because I bet you there's strength in that. That's the first thing. There's strength in that. There's strength in being able to go back and regroup, if you like. Because don't forget, when you leave America and look at Africa, again, like I established, it doesn't mean you're running away. No, it doesn't mean you're running. It does not mean you're running. It means that you're repositioning yourself. And I will call it you're regrouping. And I have something I wrote down. He said, repatriating to Africa doesn't mean you're running away from the fight. You're regrouping and repositioning to give the next generation an advantage. I believe, in my opinion, that we have to look at repatriating back to Africa as we trying to give the next generation, a better leg or better hand in the fight. Okay, we're giving them some type of advantage, because think about it this way. We're giving them an advantage economically. We're giving them an advantage emotionally and spiritually. Because let me bring it to normal terms. Imagine a young man in America who has been in America all his life, and all he's ever known is America. So everything he fights for, everything he ever does, the focus is that this is all I have. So, I mean, I don't have any other alternative. So whatever it takes to do whatever it is, I'm going to do it here. Yes, it's a good thought. But you see, when the young man also realizes that there's another place for me, that I don't have to necessarily live here, but there's a place I can actually now build, so that the next person I raise is actually going to have two places to really belong to. And that makes them fight from a position of strength. Because think about it, when a person like, let's say myself, who has, of course, I'm from Ghana. So let's say I have Ghanaian citizenship, or even not citizenship, I have a right to be in Ghana, and I have roots in Ghana. Now I'm in America today. Technically, I have roots in America as well. Now, I have an advantage because tomorrow I can get up and go to Africa, build anything I want to build, come back to America, build anything I want to build. When I'm fighting in America for whatever reason, I'm not fighting because that's all I have. No. I'm fighting because it is wrong for somebody to treat another person like that, but not because I don't have an alternative. So we shift, we begin to fight on a different grounds or premise. Because now I feel like we're fighting on the premise of, for the most part, it's like, we've worked for this, so this is all we have. So there's no way out, so do or die. Yes, it's a good way to look at it. But I think that when we begin to shift that mindset to, we're fighting today, not just the injustice in America, but fighting to have a place in Africa, so that my child and my child's child will have two places, two strengths to fight from, both economically, spiritually. Because I bet you, when our children reconcile with Africa, it gives a certain type of spiritual strength to them. And you may not get it, but when you're now dealing with anything in America, you deal with it in a different spirit, in a different light than, you know, it's like fighting in anger. When you're fighting in anger, although you're fighting for just cause, but you're losing both ways. You've lost something, but now that you're upset, you're also losing. And for those of us who know a little bit of Bible story, if you look at a man like David and a man called Ahithophel, who had offended Ahithophel by sleeping with his daughter. Now, Ahithophel was upset. He was bitter about David because David had done something wrong. But at the end of the day, he hanged himself. Why? Because he was bitter. So he was fighting for a just cause, but because of the place he was fighting from, he ended up dying at the end of the day. So he lost twice. And I believe when we don't begin to consider Africa as an alternative, not for running, but as a place where we are rebuilding strength and giving the next generation an advantage, we'll be fighting in anger. And we're fighting in anger because we feel like this is all we have. We end up losing twice. That's what I feel like. So I believe that we have to look at repatriating back to Africa differently. Don't look at it as you're running. Look at it as you're building economic, spiritual, and emotional grounds for your next generation. Because when your next generation now have a firm grounds in America, in Africa, it doesn't take away their Americanness. No. It doesn't mean they can't come back to America. They'll always be African Americans. It doesn't matter. They can always come back and do anything they want to do. The world is a global village. You can do business either way. There are people from Africa who are living here, who have citizenship, who have green cards and all of that. They're still Africans and they still have their citizenship and whatever back home. They can go there at any time. They built properties there. They built properties here. Now we're fighting to make our children global, citizens. And that's what we'll be doing, especially for people who feel like their forefathers came here and have fought and have survived all this while and have left something for them they have to keep holding on to. You see, those people have to now begin to look at Africa that, look, I'm going to fight to be able to have a place in Africa today so that my next generation, when they are fighting, they fight from both sides. They fight not because they're angry necessarily at the injustice, but they're fighting because, of course, a wrong has been done and we need to correct it, not because I have nowhere to go to, or that anger that you're taking something away from me. No, they fight from a different grounds. So what we'll be doing is we'll be making our kids, our next generation, citizens of Africa and citizens of America. Because think about it, when you're African American, you have just one citizenship, America. But there's one aspect you're missing, which is the Africa part. And it's through repatriation that we begin to look at that aspect, so that you become more of a global citizen. In going back to your origin, you're not running away from here, you can come back. But at the same time, you've now solidified the other part of you, which is the African part of you, which is your true origin. You've solidified that. That is very key. Now, maybe you don't want to move to Africa necessarily, but anything that you do now, every decision you take now, it's not about you. It's about the next generation, like others have been fighting for you. Let me give you a typical scenario. I equate it to something in the Bible, you know, about the Egyptians and the Israelites. We talk about this story a lot, but I just want to make some inference in that story. Now, look at a situation whereby the Israelites find themselves in Egypt. For some reasons, they were not from there originally. It was through different, if you look at the stories, through different means that the Israelites eventually found themselves in Egypt. And there were seven, they were working, hard labor. If you look at the story, according to what the holy books, the holy scriptures tell us, they were struggling, they were being punished, they were being dealt with, they were whipped. They were doing all of these things, there were all of these injustice against the people of Israel who were in Egypt. Now, something transpired. Now, they eventually found a way of making it back to Israel or to the promised land. Now, the point I want to establish here is that the people that actually left Egypt from all their suffering and their toils and made it back and were making it back to the promised land, it wasn't about them, because a lot of them, almost all of them, didn't make it to the promised land. But all that they were fighting for throughout the desert and all the places they found themselves was so that their next generation will have a place they can call home, where nobody really fights them for it. Because you see, maybe when you go to Africa today, because you're African American and you know you're from Trinidad, you're from wherever, you're coming to Africa, you feel like you don't belong so much. But you see, when you have a child, from that point onwards, your child is going to be treated differently. Your child is going to be different. Because don't forget, now they're coming up from that place. So they become a little bit different than you going back. So just like the Israelites, when they left Egypt, the goal was that in the future, which is today, the Israelites that were struggling in Egypt will have a place they can call home. It does not mean today somebody from Israel cannot go to Egypt. They can go back there. There's no problem with that. They can always go back. For whatever reason, they could buy a house in Egypt and do anything there. But now they have a solid place they can call home. So now when there's something happening in the world, in Egypt or wherever, and they're fighting, they're not fighting because they have no other place to be and all they have is Egypt. They're fighting because there's an injustice being done and they're dealing with the injustice. And I think when we begin to look at that, we begin to look at the fight from a different perspective. And we'll fight not angry, but we'll fight because, of course, a wrong has been done. And we are not attached necessarily. We're not attaching our all to it. We're dealing with the situation and moving on. Still happy. We can take our bags and go back to Africa, build our businesses, come back here, deal with any situation we want to deal with. And that's how life is going to go on. Because I bet you in the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, if you have not really considered repatriation, you're leaving the next generation to a disadvantage, I bet you. Because there's a move. Maybe, you know, God has given us a message. Who knows? It's been ongoing. Nobody desired this. But maybe it's trying to give us, God is trying to give us an awakening that, look, although we're fighting for an injustice which is happening here, let's also relook at where we are coming from. And there's a point I'd like to address, because there's a lot of African Americans. I've read a lot of comments from different, you know, pages and different groups where people have shared things about repatriation and all of that. And a lot of people talk about, you know, one of the things people talk about is, well, who says we accepted in Africa? Who says we accept it? I mean, people don't accept. People even give examples of times they've been to Africa and a lot of different things have happened, you know, and that proves that, well, we are not also accepted here. But, you know, I want you to look at it with a different type of appreciation. You know, when you go to a place, it does not matter where. Even in Ghana, when you leave Accra, one place to Kumasi, when you meet the Kumasi guys are not just going to random, instantly, you know, open arms and necessarily welcome you, because, I mean, we're humans. Everybody could be a threat, whether they look like you or not. But the level is a little low based on whether or not you have something in common. So it is up to you to now understand that look, when you go into a new place, although it's a place you originate from, but you've not been there for some time, so you have to go back with a different appreciation and a different attitude. And when you do that, the what do you call it? The pushback will not be as it is when you go forceful that, yeah, I bet this is my origin, you need to give me citizenship. That type of attitude creates a lot of problems. Okay, everybody likes to protect their territory. I can tell you, Africans are very friendly and very welcoming. Anybody who has been there can tell you, you can have some pushbacks from some people at different times, but overall, they're very welcoming. But like every human being, sometimes we like to protect our territory. So it's up to you to come with a different attitude. Of course, a lot of education need to go on in Africa as well. Every day I tell my wife that Africa, there's a need for a lot of education in terms of the acceptance of people from the diaspora. It is very key. However, that does not also mean that those from the diaspora also should come with some force of, let me use the word, entitlement. Because if you've not been there for some time, although you're welcome there, although it's your origin, you have to come with a certain type of humility to warm your way into it, because it's not about you. That's what I always want people to get. It's not about you, it's about the next generation. So everything you do, when you decide to be humble, to be able to ingrain into African community, it's not about you, it's about the next generation. So you're doing it for your children, your children's children, so they become global citizens. So they can fight for injustice in America, but then they have a place in Africa. They can build both ways. They can build it, they can build it, because now we are limited. All we are fighting for. You see, yesterday I was watching the news and there was a lot of rebel in Minneapolis, if I got it right. People were burning shops and all of that. Now think about it. As a result of the injustice, people are burning down shops. Some of those shops, I bet you, will be for Black people. Will be for people of color. Will be for maybe some innocent people. And it could be a place that other Black people actually service. So at the end of the day, because of where we are fighting from for justice, we're losing out at the end of the day. We're losing out. So we have to begin to draw a fine line between fighting for our children to become global citizens, where they have some say in Africa at the same time in America. So when they're fighting for justice in America, they're fighting from a different grounds. Because I bet you, all the people that have come before us, who have been fighting, something inside of them is not only fighting for justice, they're also fighting so that at least their children and children's children will find themselves in a world where, of course, nobody's going to treat them by their color and all of that. Yes, that's the goal. But part of accomplishing that goal, I'm telling you, repatriation plays a huge role in that. We can decide to beat around the bush and deny it and all of that. But I'm telling you, part of that solution comes with repatriation. Understanding that it doesn't mean you're running away, but the fact that you're fighting for common grounds, both ways, here and there. Because don't forget, that's where you originate from. So going back to where you originate from doesn't mean you're running from where you currently are. Because you see, the way I will fight for justice in America, I'll fight without being so attached. But other people will fight becoming so attached. There's nothing wrong being attached, but when you become so attached to something you're solving, you treat it differently. It becomes very difficult. And I'm telling you, you can fight from a different grounds when you repatriate. Maybe you may not, but when you repatriate, what you do is you give your children an advantage to fight on a different field, on a different playing field. And that's what I'm submitting to you. You're going to create an economic strength, a spiritual strength, an emotional strength for the next generation. That's what you'll be doing today. If you fight today, not just for injustice in America, but also to repatriate back to Africa. So anytime you lift anything to fight to remind people that, look, there's a place called Africa that you can also look at, go to and build something from there. It does not mean don't fight for justice in America, but relook at how you're fighting. Very, very important. And like I said, if you look at the Egyptian story and the Israelites, the people were fighting for their next generation. They didn't make it to the promised land, but at the end of the day, they gave their children some place. And now, when you go to Africa, then now we have to protect what we have with all our might. So what okay for us to be in this position doesn't happen again. But you see, when we don't repatriate, we're losing strength and momentum. Very key and very important. So that's my little take on this whole situation. Being able to draw the line between fighting for the injustice in America and repatriating to Africa. Drawing that fine line to understand that repatriating back to Africa amidst all the things that are happening in America doesn't mean you're running from a fight. But all you're doing is you're creating an advantage for the next generation to become global citizens, so they can fight from a different fighting plane. So they can be Africans and Americans at the same time. Because now a lot of people are fighting as Americans. Of course, they have the title African Americans, but they're fighting as Americans. That's a reality. But you see, when you have a place in Africa, which we've been calling people that they are welcome, they can always come back. When you have a place there, you now fight as a global citizen, like people who are fighting from Ghana, fighting from anywhere in the world. And you don't fight because you have nowhere to go to. And I think that's very key for us to look at. Now, let me look at a comment that somebody passed. Is that our forefathers, the first ones, fought to go home, but through beatings and mental oppression, stopped fighting for home. They began fighting for inclusion into a system never meant for them. That is a very powerful statement. Infinite Grasek, I think. That is very powerful. So he says our forefathers were fighting, like the Gavis and all of that. Of course, a lot of them were fighting for people to go back to Africa. But at the end of the day, they stopped fighting. Why? They stopped fighting for people to go back. They began looking at it differently. They began looking at it for fighting for inclusion. And that's why I said when we fight for our children to become global citizens, they'll be fighting differently. I bet you they'll be fighting not necessarily for inclusion, but they'll be fighting for injustice. Today, people, we look at it like we're fighting for justice, but we're actually fighting for inclusion. There's a fine line there where you're fighting for justice and where you're fighting for inclusion. You see, I have solid roots in Africa. I'm a Ghanaian. I have a place in Ghana. When I'm fighting in America for whatever is happening, I'm fighting for justice. I'm not fighting for inclusion. They can include me or not. It doesn't mean I can't be in America. I can still be in America and build anything I want to build in America. But I'll be fighting from a different perspective. And that's what people need to understand. And that's what repatriation does. Repatriation, what it does for you is that it makes you fight from a different plane. It makes you fight not for inclusion, but for justice. But when you fail to consider repatriation piece, all you're doing is you think you're fighting for justice, but you're actually fighting to be included. And somebody said in a place that you're never wanted. Yes, that's a reality. I mean, we didn't want to be in America, like we always say, but we're forced to be here. So now that we're here, we're going to protect our territory. Yes, that's true. But there's always a caveat. I don't think that's the best way to fight. The comments that our forefathers were fighting for us to go back home, but they stopped and began to fight for inclusion, and that became a disaster. When you're fighting for inclusion, you fight with so much anger. And when you fight with anger, you always lose. When you fight with anger, you always lose. But when you fight for justice, Not because you're fighting to be included in anything. You fight with some joy. You fight because an injustice has been made and you're trying to correct it. And it comes from a place of love, I should tell you. And not from a place of hatred. Because hate doesn't do you any good. Like I told you, that a man like Ahithophel, out of bitterness, fighting for a just cause, ended up dying. So he lost twice. He lost something already, which he's fighting for. But because we're fighting from a place of bitterness, he lost again. He committed suicide. And that's what we're having right now if we don't consider repatriation for the next generation. I don't look at it for today. Anybody today who's in America that has not repatriated back to Africa, you have to begin to look at it for the next generation. Very key and very important. If you have any question you want to ask me, you can ask me. I was dealing with drawing the fine line between black injustice in America and repatriating back to Africa. Repatriating back to Africa doesn't mean you're running away from a fight, but it means that you're trying to go to a place where you can fight from a different perspective and a different terrain. Not fighting for inclusion, but fighting for justice, fighting for justice, and not fighting for inclusion. Because don't forget, it's a cliche. You think you're fighting for injustice. No, but you're actually fighting to be included in something, but you fight differently. If you have any questions for me, you can ask. Otherwise, I'll and somebody said, I'm glad you're addressing the acceptance piece. Yes, of course. The acceptance piece in Africa is very key, but that should not be a barrier for you making the move. That should not be a barrier for you making a move. The fact that you go to a place and they don't accept you so much in the beginning doesn't mean that overall you'll not be accepted. I'm telling you. Once it's a place of origin, relook at it. And don't forget, Africa is a big place, 50-something countries, about 55 countries. If you go to the first one, they're not receptive. Go to the next one. I bet you somebody will accept you. And it doesn't have to be like that. Of course, everywhere you go to, they have to accept you. But like I said, people protect their territory. So until you demonstrate to them that you're not harmful, it becomes problematic. And when you come with that proud attitude, that because I belong here, I have to definitely have a say, that becomes problematic. But when you fight from a place of humility, I bet you have a good place and you help the next generation. Very key and very important. If you have any question, you can ask me before I run off. What is my time? It's 4:50. All right. So yes. There's a lot of injustice in America, which we've been fighting for it, and we've been dealing with it all this while. And we'll keep fighting for it. We'll keep talking about it and fighting for it. But that should prompt us to also relook at Africa as a place we can actually go to. Now, if you need help in this journey of making it back to Africa, not running, but creating a different terrain for your children and your children's children, trying to make them global citizens, trying to make relevant their African part of the Americanness. You can contact Certified Africa because we've made it a goal to help as many people as possible. So you can always reach out to us. Mr. Cooper, it's great to have you here. If you have any question for me, I was dealing with drawing the line between black injustice in America and repatriating to Africa. And the fact that talking about repatriation back to Africa doesn't mean we're running away from a fight, but we're trying to position ourselves so we can fight from a better place, not for inclusion, but for real injustice. So that's what I talk about. And I talk about the fact that repatriating back to Africa helps us to regroup and reposition, giving the next generation an advantage economically, spiritually, and emotionally. It gives us two of both worlds. It makes us citizens of Africa and America. We will fight from a different terrain. That's what I was dealing with, So I think I'll be running. Like I said, if I don't have any question, this is Niam Akwe with Certified Africa. You can follow Certified Africa on Facebook and on Instagram. Yeah, you can follow us. I bring you greetings from my beautiful wife, who is a co-founder, who is not here. A position of leverage. Good, Mr. Derek. That's a good word. From a position of leverage. Very key. Very key. Very key. I feel sad when I hear people saying, "Well, we're not to consider repatriation. We're not going anywhere. We're not going anywhere." Nobody's saying go and never come back, never look back. No, but we're saying that you need to have some leverage, like Mr. Cooper puts it. You need to have some leverage. And when you're fighting, you fight differently. You fight differently. I'm telling you, you won't understand. You fight differently. Sometimes, based on your position, you may not really catch how it feels to be in a different position. And until you can make the conscious effort to make that shift, into the neutral position, you can't appreciate the conversation. You know, you can't appreciate the conversation when it comes to repatriation and all the injustice that is happening here. Nobody should ever tell anybody to stop dealing with, the injustice in America. We'll keep fighting. We'll keep doing whatever we're doing. But nobody should also ever discourage you from considering repatriating back to Africa and giving your next generation an advantage in this fight. Because this fight hasn't ended. I'm telling you, look at where it started from. It started long ago. And look at where we are today. It's not ending today, I bet you. It's not ending today. But let's give the next generation a better advantage. I'm telling you, and when we consider repatriation, the advantage we give the continent that will have a say. Do you know why, America have positioned themselves in such a way that anything that is happening in other parts of the world, they have so much power that when they speak, they can influence those places. Imagine what power we'll have when we repatriate back to Africa and we send all the economic benefits and everything back to Africa. And we regroup and reposition. When Africa speaks that, look, if you don't stop what is happening to Black people in America, we're going to shut down every importation that you do, because every raw material comes from Africa. We're going to shut all of that, the mines and everything. We're going to shut it down. Think about it, the power that we'll possess as a continent. It will be different. And that's what we want to give the next generation that opportunity to do that. So they become global citizens and they fight from a different plane. That's all I'm saying. Let's draw that line. So we're not against repatriation. At the same time, we're not against injustice in America or fighting for justice. It's very key. Don't fight for one and leave the other. A lot of people are for repatriation. They don't want to care about any injustice in America. That's wrong. No, you're not drawing the proper line. And a lot of people are for fighting for injustice in America. They don't care. They don't want to talk about repatriating back to Africa. That's a mistake as well. Let's build a common ground where we create global citizens of ourselves. So everybody working in America, the next generation, they know that they have a place in Africa at the same time they have a place in America. It becomes a consciousness. We fight differently. All right, so God bless you all. Thank you, Thebo Asha. Said, I love the perspective. Somebody said, great words. Thank you all. Somebody said, I'm starting my family in Africa. That's great. I'm telling you, your next generation is going to fight as global citizens. So they can still come back to America and fight for injustices. Their voice will be stronger, I bet you, when they're fighting. They'll not fight from a place of anger, from a place of bitterness, but they'll fight from a place that something wrong is being done and we want to just correct it and set a record straight and move forward, which is a different perspective from fighting for inclusion, So thank you so much. God bless you all. Have a beautiful, beautiful weekend. This has been Certified Africa. Nyama with Certified Africa. Greetings from my wife. I keep saying greetings from my wife because I know she's watching me right now. Yeah. So God bless you all. Have a beautiful, beautiful weekend. If you want to know anything about how you can repatriate to Africa, you can reach us out on Certified Africa. Hey, who's coming behind me? All right. So I'll be going off. God bless you. All the best. Let me